In the architecture diagram that we initially discussed at the starting of this section, we successfully set up the KeyCloak auth server inside our local. So now there can be two types of applications who want to interact with my KeyCloak auth server in order to get an access token or ID token so that they can start interacting with the resource server. First, let's try to consider the example of Postman. So Postman application will help us to invoke any REST APIs that are deployed on resource server. But since resource server is a secured place where all my resources are deployed like account details, card details, loans details, so my Postman can't directly invoke. First, it has to get the access token from the KeyCloak server. The same access token it can go and hand over to the resource server in order to get the response from the resource server. So here, though I said it is a Postman app, but it can be any scenario where one API trying to interact with other API. Like if you consider inside the microservices network, one microservice may be trying to interact with the other microservice. So there will be no user involved. It's just that two systems are trying to connect with each other so that the information between them can be shared securely after properly authenticating and authorizing the application that is trying to get the data from a secured resource server. So if you recall our previous OAuth2 framework deep dive discussions, in the scenarios where there is no user involved, we have to adopt client credentials OAuth2 flow. As you can see, this is the client credentials grant type that we have inside OAuth2. So here there is no user involved. A client application, it can be a microservice application trying to interact with the resource server to get a data from it. But since resource server is a secured application, first it will try to interact with the auth server saying that these are my client ID and client secret. So there is no user involved. Please give me an access token. Once my auth server, which is here KeyCloak server, validate the client credentials, it will hand over a token to the client. And once the access token is given to the client, my client will try to invoke resource server directly with the access token to get the response from it. If the access token is really a valid access token, my resource server will give you a proper response to my client. So how my resource server will know whether a given access token is valid or not is, it will try to go and check with the authorization server internally to understand the validity of the given access token. So now we have a clear understanding what is client credentials grant type. So in order to invoke my resource server REST APIs to get accounts details, card details, loans details, first I need a client credentials which will help me to get an access token. Using that access token, I can invoke my secure REST APIs deployed on resource server to get a proper response. So in order to create a client, you have to make sure that you are in the right realm. So here you can see we are on the right realm, which is EazyBank Dev. So click on the clients. By default, there are certain clients created by the KeyCloak server for internal operations. But since I want to create a brand new client credentials, I need to click create. So here client ID I can give as EazyBank API. Since this client is used only for API to API invocation, I'm giving the client ID name as EazyBank API. So the client protocol, obviously it has to be OpenID Connect, which is built on top of OAuth2 framework. So I'm clicking save. So once my client is created, you can see the client name is displayed on the top. If you want, you can again go to clients and look for the EazyBank API. So here the client is created, but in order to know the secret of my client or credentials of my client, first I have to provide details about my client. So as you know, there are many grant type flows inside OAuth2 framework. The very standard grant type flow is authorization code flow. But here, since there is no user involved, we can disable the standard flow, which is authorization code flow. If you hover on the question mark, it will clearly show this is the authorization code flow. but since there is no user involved, I'm just turning it off. Similarly, implicit flow also involved user, so let it disable. And direct access grant also involves user, because this is the resource owner credentials directly handovering to the client. But here, since there is no resource owner, there is no user, we can disable this also. Select access type as confidential, because our client will maintain client ID and client secret. It is not like open to public. Only who has access to client secret, then only they can use client application detail and invoke the KeyCloak server APIs to get the access token. So once I change to confidential, you can see I got one more option, which is service accounts enabled. So here service accounts enabled supports client credentials grant, which means there are two service accounts, like one API is trying to interact with the other API. So this is the perfect flow that we want to follow. So let's make it on. Once we make those changes, scroll down and click save. As soon as you click save, there will be a credentials tab that comes on the top. So if you see, this is the secret that your client should use whenever they're trying to interact with the KeyCloak server for an access token. So my client ID is EazyBank API and the secret is this one. So if you want to regenerate, you can click, which will give you a new secret ID. So this way we successfully set up a client that can be used in the client credentials grant type flow. So let's try to set up the resource server in the next lecture, so that we can make it all this together work to get the access token and pass that to resource server, and resource server can validate with the auth server and provide a proper response to the Postman application. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye.